So we're very honored to have Ben Bernanke as our special guest, and while I don't think he really needs an introduction, I think he deserves an introduction, so let me give him an appropriate introduction. He is a native of Dillon, South Carolina, and how many people know where Dillon, South Carolina is? Okay, so you all know that's where south of the border is. And any of you ever driven down? Well, if you drove down there in the 1970s, your waiter during the summers might have been Ben Bernanke, because he worked there as a waiter, and he actually had a precocious career growing up there. He was so talented in the first grade that after just 2 weeks in the first grade, they skipped into second grade. That's pretty impressive. He was the spelling bee champion of South Carolina and came to Washington, I think at the age of 13, to compete in the National Spelling Bee, but he didn't win because he misspelled the word Edelweiss, and that's because The Sound of Music had never played in Dillon, South Carolina. In high school, he was valedictorian of his class, not surprisingly, and had the highest SAT score in the entire state. Got a scholarship to Harvard, went to Harvard, graduated summa cum laude in economics, not surprisingly, in 1975. In 1979, he got his PhD at MIT. From that point, he went to teach from 1979 to 1985 at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford and taught economics. And then he was lured back to the East Coast by Princeton University, which made him a tenured faculty member at the age of 31. And he taught at Princeton Economics Department for many years and became, from 1998 to 2002, the chairman of that department. And then he got a call from Glenn Hubbard asking whether he'd be interested in perhaps government service. He was recruited to serve on the Federal Reserve Board. You say in your book that you ultimately became the chairman of the economics department, and your big decision was whether you have donuts or bagels at the economic
that was very
conference meetings.
Yes. Yeah.
So he is interested in many other things other than economics. One of them is baseball. Was originally a devoted Los Angeles Dodgers fan, then became a devoted Boston Red Sox fan, as now is a devoted, very committed Washington Nationals fan. Did you actually serve dinners and so forth at the south of the border?
Well, sure. So my family had been there since 1941 when my grandfather moved and bought a drugstore there. And my father and uncle were the town pharmacists. They were known as Dr. Mort and Dr. Phil because there was only like one doctor in the entire town, and so people would come to them and ask them for, medical advice of various kinds. And it was a small Jewish community. There were, we had about 50 people within 20-mile radius. So it was in some ways it was like being a fish out of water in some ways, and that made me want to look at the bigger world. But in other ways, it was actually a very interesting formative experience because it's not a rich area. A lot of people work really hard. I worked construction. I waited tables. I did wait on tables at south of the border. I was even Pedro. Pedro is the mascot.
Right.
You can tell by my coloring and my beard. I actually had the right look. So I did that a couple of times.
Who were the best tippers in those days?
The best tippers were the guys from so south of the border. It's south of the North Carolina-South Carolina border. It's halfway between New York and Miami. And so you had the snowbirds coming down, driving down, and it was a 2-day drive in those days. People didn't fly. And they would stop and stay overnight south of the border. So these guys, New Jersey, New York, those were the best tippers. Southerners are wonderful, hospitable people, but they are lousy tippers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ben, there's been a lot of talk about a housing bubble, particularly, from the Fed, from all sorts of different places. Can you give us your view as to whether or not there is a housing bubble out there?
Well, unquestionably, housing prices are up quite a bit. I think it's important to note that fundamentals are also very strong. We've got a growing economy, jobs, incomes. We've got very low mortgage rates. We've got demographics supporting housing growth. We've got restricted supply in some places. So it's certainly understandable that the prices would go up some. I don't know whether prices are exactly where they should be, but I think it's fair to say that much of what's happened is supported by the strength of the economy.
Tell me, what is the worst case scenario? So we have so many economists coming on our air and saying, oh, this is a bubble and it's going to burst and this is going to be a real issue for the economy. Some say it could even cause a recession at some point. What is the worst case scenario if, in fact, we were to see prices come down substantially across the country?
Well, I guess I don't buy your premise. It's a pretty unlikely possibility. We've never had a decline in house prices on a nationwide basis. So what I think is more likely is that house prices will slow, maybe stabilize, might slow consumption spending a bit. I don't think it's going to drive the economy too far from its full employment path, though.
So would you agree with Alan Greenspan's comments recently that we've got some areas of the country that are seeing froth, not necessarily a national situation, but certainly froth in some areas?
You can see some types of speculation, investors turning over condos quickly. So those sorts of things you see in some local areas. I'm hopeful that, and I'm confident, in fact, that the bank regulators will pay close attention to the kinds of loans that are being made, making sure that underwriting is done right. But I do think that this is mostly a localized problem and not something that's going to affect the national economy.
This scenario envisions that consumer spending, supported by rising incomes and the recent decline in energy prices, will continue to grow near its trend rate, and that the drag on the economy from the housing sectors will gradually diminish. The motor vehicle sector may already be showing signs of strengthening. After having cut production significantly in recent months in response to the rise in the inventory of unsold vehicles, automakers appear to have boosted the assembly rate a bit in November, and they have scheduled further increases for December. The effects of the housing correction on real economic activity are likely to persist into next year, as I've already noted. But the rate of decline in home construction should slow as the inventory of unsold new homes is gradually worked down.
There's plenty of liquidity out there. He said he did not sense a lack of liquidity in the market. And he said we're monitoring the markets, but didn't really make any conclusions. So he went as far as he had to go, but not further.
He also calmed the fears about the subprime market, which were rippling through Wall Street yesterday, and said we're taking a look at it, but right now it doesn't seem to be an issue, but we're watching it, certainly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let's first take a listen to what Ben Bernanke had to say about the economy.
So we expect moderate growth going forward. We believe that if the housing sector begins to stabilize, and if some of the inventory corrections that are still going on in manufacturing begin to be completed, that there's a reasonable possibility that we'll see some strengthening of the economy sometime during the middle of the year.
He went on to talk about the subprime market. Another fear yesterday was that there'd be contagion, but not in the eyes of Ben Bernanke.
Our assessment is that there's not much indication at this point that subprime mortgage issues have spread into the broader mortgage market, which still seems to be healthy, and the lending side of that still seems to be healthy. The pace of home sales seems likely to remain sluggish for a time, partly as a result of some tightening in lending standards and the recent increase in mortgage interest rates. Sales should ultimately be supported by growth in income and employment, as well as by mortgage rates that, despite the recent increase, remain fairly low relative to historical norms. However, even if demand stabilizes as we expect, the pace of construction will probably fall somewhat further as builders work down the stocks of unsold new homes. Thus, declines in residential construction will likely continue to weigh on economic growth over coming quarters, although the magnitude of the drag on growth should diminish over time. The global economy continues to be strong. Supported by solid economic growth abroad, U.S. exports should expand further in coming quarters. Overall, the U.S. economy appears likely to expand at a moderate pace over the second half of 2007, with growth then strengthening a bit in 2008 to a rate close to the economy's underlying trend.
We swap our currency, dollars, for their currency, euros. They take the dollars, lend it out to the banks in their jurisdiction. That helps bring down interest rates in the global market for dollars. And meanwhile, we're not lending to those banks, we're lending to the central bank. The central bank is responsible for repaying us.
So who got the money?
To financial institutions in Europe and other countries.
Which ones?
I don't know.
$500 billion, and you don't know who got the money?
The loan went to the loans go to the central banks, and they then put them out to their institutions to try to bring down short-term interest rates in dollar markets around the world.